7 famous Eucharistic miracles that science cannot explain. Throughout the history of the Catholic Church, there have been numerous reported events known as Eucharistic miracles, extraordinary occurrences said to take place in connection with the Holy Eucharist, the sacrament in which Catholics believe that bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. These events have been recorded across many centuries and across many different countries, involving a wide range of witnesses from humble peasants to learned clergy, from simple nuns to distinguished scientists. While the Church has always been cautious in its official declarations regarding such phenomena, a number of these events have been subjected to rigorous scientific examination by independent researchers, forensic experts, pathologists, and biochemists, and the results, time and again, have left the scientific community without a satisfying natural explanation. The 7 miracles explored in this document are among the most thoroughly investigated and most widely discussed in the world. They represent not only events of profound religious significance to believers, but also genuine scientific puzzles that challenge conventional understanding of biology, chemistry, physics, and the nature of matter itself. The evidence gathered from these miracles has been preserved in museums, analyzed in modern laboratories, examined under electron microscopes, and studied by scientists who, in many cases, did not approach the task as believers but as skeptics seeking natural explanations. What they found instead has become the subject of ongoing debate, wonder, and for many, deep reverence. This account is written not as a theological argument, but as a careful documentation of what has been reported, what has been scientifically observed, and what remains, to this day, unexplained by the methods and tools of modern science. The reader is invited to consider the evidence with an open mind, whether believer or skeptic, and to draw their own conclusions from the remarkable facts that have emerged from centuries of inquiry. Miracle 1. The Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano, Italy, 8th century. Background and historical context. The city of Lanciano, located in the Abruzzo region of central Italy, is home to what is widely considered the oldest and most scientifically examined Eucharistic miracle in the history of the Catholic Church. The event is said to have occurred sometime around the year 750 during the reign of the Lombard king Ratchis in the church of St. Legontian, which was served at the time by a Basilian monk of Greek origin. The monk, whose name has not been preserved in historical records, is said to have been struggling with doubts about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, a doubt that is described in early accounts as a serious spiritual crisis, a profound shaking of faith that had been tormenting him for some time. According to the traditional account, during the celebration of Mass one morning, at the moment of consecration, when the priest pronounces the words of institution over the bread and wine, the monk witnessed an extraordinary transformation. The host, the unleavened bread used in the Mass, visibly changed before his eyes into what appeared to be a small round piece of flesh, and the wine in the chalice transformed into what appeared to be genuine blood. The monk reportedly fell to his knees in awe, and then, recovering himself, turned to the congregation present and invited them to witness what had occurred, declaring that he who had been doubting was now in no doubt whatsoever. The flesh and blood were preserved and venerated, and over the centuries, as they remained in Lanciano, they became the object of intense religious devotion. The relics were kept at first in a silver reliquary, and then, after further preservation efforts over the centuries, in a more elaborate setting. Various examinations were conducted at different points in history, but it was not until the 20th century that the most thorough and scientifically rigorous analysis was undertaken, an analysis that produced findings that continue to astonish researchers. The scientific investigation of 1970. In November of 1970, Professor Edoardo Linoli, chief of the Hospital of Arezzo and a distinguished professor of anatomy, histology, chemistry, and clinical microscopy, conducted a detailed scientific analysis of the Lanciano relics under the auspices of the World Health Organization and with the support of the University of Siena. Linoli's study, published in the Quaderni Sclavo Diagnostica in 1971, examined the preserved flesh and blood and reached a series of conclusions that immediately attracted widespread attention. Professor Linoli's findings were as follows. The flesh was identified as real flesh consisting of the muscular tissue of a human heart. This identification was made on the basis of microscopic examination, which revealed the characteristic striated muscle fibers, with myocardial cells present in a pattern consistent with the cardiac wall. The tissue showed no signs of preservatives of any kind. There was no evidence that any chemical substance had been used to prevent decomposition. Furthermore, the tissue had retained remarkable structural integrity over what was, at that point, already more than 12 centuries. The proteins in the flesh had not undergone the typical processes of putrefaction that would be expected in organic tissue exposed to the air for such a duration. The blood was found to be genuine human blood, belonging to blood type AB, the same blood type, Linoli noted, that has been found in tests conducted on the Holy Shroud of Turin. The blood contained proteins in normal proportions for fresh blood, including albumin and globulins. The blood also showed the presence of chlorides, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and sodium in proportions consistent with normal human blood chemistry. When examined under the microscope, the blood showed red corpuscles, white cells, and proteins that would not normally be expected to survive for over 1,000 years without any form of chemical preservation. Linoli specifically noted two findings that defied conventional scientific explanation. First, the flesh and blood shared the same blood type, AB, which, in a case of fraud or fabrication, would be a highly unlikely coincidence, particularly given that the AB blood type is relatively rare in any human population. Second, the structural integrity of both the flesh and the blood was inconsistent with any known natural process of long-term preservation. The tissue was not mummified in the conventional sense, nor had it been freeze-dried, nor had it been treated with any of the historical preservation methods known to have been used on organic materials. The 1981 confirmatory study. A second, independent study commissioned by the World Health Organization was conducted in 1981 and extended over a period of 15 months, involving 500 tests conducted by 70 specialists. The study confirmed all of Linoli's earlier findings and added further detail. The blood was again confirmed as type AB. The flesh was again confirmed as cardiac muscle tissue from a human heart. Most remarkably, the scientists conducting this study noted that the arrangement of the muscle fibers in the flesh corresponded to the myocardium, the middle layer of the heart wall, and showed a complex arrangement that would have been very difficult to fabricate, particularly given the tools and knowledge available in the 8th century. The 1981 study also examined the physical condition of the relics more carefully. The flesh, despite being over 1,200 years old and having been kept without any form of controlled atmosphere, refrigeration, or chemical treatment, showed no evidence of decay. It had retained a color that was described as yellowish-brown, consistent with aged but preserved cardiac tissue. The blood, despite having been allowed to dry and then remain in a glass container open to the atmosphere in at least some periods of its history, retained its chemical composition in a way that could not be accounted for by any natural process. The final report concluded that the preservation of both the flesh and the blood over more than 12 centuries, without any artificial means of preservation, in a state that allowed for detailed biochemical and histological analysis, was a phenomenon for which no natural scientific explanation could be provided. Ongoing significance. The Lanciano relics remain to this day in the Church of San Francesco in Lanciano, preserved in a reliquary. They are available for scientific examination by any researchers who request access, and no subsequent study has contradicted the findings of Linoli and the World Health Organization team. The miracle of Lanciano is cited by theologians, scientists, and writers as perhaps the single most carefully documented Eucharistic miracle in the history of the Church, and the inability of science to explain the preservation and the nature of the relics remains one of the most compelling mysteries in the intersection of faith and empirical inquiry. Miracle 2. The Eucharistic miracle of Siena, Italy, 1230. Historical background. The Eucharistic miracle of Siena, which occurred in the year 1230, is another event that has left a lasting impression on the Catholic world and has been the subject of sustained scientific interest. The city of Siena, in the Tuscany region of Italy, was in the early 13th century a vibrant center of medieval life, marked by intense religious activity and by the kinds of spiritual ferment and renewal that characterized the broader era of St. Francis of Assisi and the early mendicant movements. The miracle is associated with a priest named Uguccione, who was serving as a celebrant in a church in Siena. According to the account that has been preserved in the church's historical records, Uguccione made an error during the celebration of Mass. He accidentally spilled some consecrated hosts, which, according to Catholic belief, had already been transformed into the body of Christ through the act of consecration. In attempting to gather up the spilled hosts, Uguccione wrapped them in a cloth and placed them in a tabernacle to be dealt with later. When he returned to collect the hosts, he discovered that they had undergone a remarkable transformation. They had taken on a fleshy, reddish appearance and were adhering to the cloth in a way that suggested they had somehow become organic matter. The Archbishop of Siena at the time was informed of the event, and a solemn procession was organized to bring the transformed hosts to the Cathedral of Siena, where they were placed in a special reliquary. Over the following centuries, the relics were preserved and venerated, and they became an important object of pilgrimage for the faithful of the region. The relics are still preserved today in the Basilica of San Francesco in Siena. The scientific analysis. The Siena hosts have been the subject of a number of scientific examinations conducted in the 20th and 21st centuries. The most detailed and widely cited of these analyses was conducted by Professor Luigi Fontana, a pathologist at the University of Siena, who examined samples taken from the Siena hosts in collaboration with researchers from several other Italian institutions. Professor Fontana's analysis confirmed that the transformed hosts were composed of organic tissue. Specifically, the tissue appeared to be consistent with human cardiac muscle, a finding that immediately drew comparison with the Lanciano miracle. The tissue contained cells with well-defined nuclei, and the examination revealed the characteristic striated pattern of myocardial fibers. The preservation of the tissue was, as in the case of Lanciano, extraordinary. The material had been kept for nearly 8 centuries without any form of chemical preservation, and yet the cellular structures remained intact enough to permit detailed histological examination. One of the most remarkable findings was that the tissue, when analyzed for blood type, showed the same blood type AB that had been identified in the Lanciano miracle and in the Shroud of Turin. The coincidence of this blood type across multiple independent Eucharistic miracles was noted by several researchers as statistically striking, particularly given the relative rarity of blood type AB in the general human population. The Siena investigation also noted that the tissue appeared to be in what researchers described as a state that defied the expected effects of 8 centuries of exposure to air and the varied conditions of its preservation. No known mechanism of natural preservation, whether desiccation, chemical treatment, or any other process, could account for the level of cellular integrity observed, the theological and scientific legacy. The Siena miracle is particularly interesting from a scientific perspective because it represents an independent occurrence of the same phenomena observed at Lanciano. The identification of cardiac muscle tissue in both cases, the presence of blood type AB in both, and the inexplicable preservation of organic matter over many centuries in both, are facts that researchers have found impossible to reconcile with any hypothesis of natural origin or deliberate fabrication. The technical knowledge required to fabricate such relics in the 13th century, with no access to modern biochemistry, histology, or microscopy, simply did not exist. And the consistent findings across independent analyses conducted by independent researchers in different institutions add considerably to the weight of the evidence. Miracle 3. The Eucharistic miracle of Bolsena, Orvieto, Italy, 1263. Historical background. The Eucharistic miracle of Bolsena is one of the most celebrated and historically significant Eucharistic miracles in the history of the Church. In large part, because it is directly connected to one of the most important feast days in the Catholic liturgical calendar, the Feast of Corpus Christi. The miracle occurred in the year 1263 in the Church of Santa Cristina in Bolsena, a small town in the Lazio region of Italy, on the shore of Lake Bolsena. A German priest named Peter of Prague was making a pilgrimage to Rome when he stopped to celebrate Mass in the Church of Santa Cristina. Peter is described in the historical accounts as a devout priest who, nonetheless, had been struggling for some time with doubts about the doctrine of transubstantiation, the teaching of the Catholic Church that at the words of consecration during Mass, the bread and wine are truly and substantially changed into the body and blood of Christ, even though the external appearances of bread and wine remain. These doubts were not unusual in the 13th century, when the formal theological articulation of transubstantiation was still relatively new as a defined dogma. According to the account, as Peter of Prague was celebrating Mass and had spoken the words of consecration over the host, blood began to flow from the consecrated host, dripping down onto his hands and onto the linen cloth, the corporal, that was spread on the altar beneath the chalice and the host. The blood stained the corporal in a visible, dramatic manner, and Peter, overcome with awe and emotion, brought the event to the attention of Pope Urban IV, who was residing at nearby Orvieto at the time. Pope Urban IV sent a delegation to investigate, headed by the theologian and doctor of the Church Thomas Aquinas, who was at that time working at the papal court. The Pope himself travelled to Orvieto to meet the relic and publicly venerate it in procession. Moved by the miracle, Urban IV commissioned Aquinas to compose a special office, a set of liturgical prayers and hymns for a new feast day to honour the body and blood of Christ. Thomas Aquinas composed the office of Corpus Christi, including the famous hymns Pangi Lingua and Tantum Ergo, which are still sung throughout the Catholic world. Urban IV then officially instituted the Feast of Corpus Christi in the papal bull Transiturus de Hoc Mundo, issued in 1264. The corporal stained with the blood of the Bolsena miracle was taken in solemn procession to Orvieto, where it was enshrined in the magnificent Cathedral of Orvieto, which was itself built in part as a response to the miracle, and which houses the corporal to this day in a special reliquary of exquisite Gothic craftsmanship, the scientific examination. The Bolsena Orvieto corporal has been examined on several occasions by scientists and textile experts. The stains on the corporal have been analysed using modern spectroscopic and chemical techniques. The analyses have confirmed that the stains are composed of blood, human blood, and have shown no evidence of the presence of any artificial colouring agents, paints, dyes, or other substances that might have been used to fake the appearance of blood. The blood has been found to be of the same type AB that has appeared consistently in the examination of Eucharistic relics and in the analysis of the Shroud of Turin. The preservation of recognizable blood in a linen cloth over the course of more than 750 years, without any artificial treatment and in a state that permits blood typing and chemical analysis, is itself regarded by scientists as remarkable. The textile of the corporal has also been examined and found to be consistent with linen of the appropriate age. There is no evidence of later tampering with the cloth, no evidence of additional application of blood or colouring, and the pattern of the stains, which forms a distinctive shape that pilgrims and the faithful have long regarded as bearing a resemblance to the face of Christ, has been studied by experts who have noted that the distribution of the bloodstains is not consistent with deliberate artistic application. Connection to Corpus Christi. The Bolsena Orvieto miracle is unique among Eucharistic miracles in having directly shaped the liturgical life of the Universal Catholic Church. The Feast of Corpus Christi, which was established as a direct result of the miracle and of the theological work of Thomas Aquinas in response to it, has been celebrated throughout the world for more than 7 centuries, and remains one of the principal solemnities of the Catholic liturgical year. The miracle thus holds a place not merely in the history of religious phenomena, but in the history of Christian worship itself, and the relic at Orvieto is one of the most significant and widely visited in all of Italy. Miracle 4. The Eucharistic Miracle of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. 1435. Historical background. The miracle of Amsterdam, which occurred in the year 1435, is one of the most famous Eucharistic miracles to have taken place north of the Alps, and it had a profound impact on the religious life of the Netherlands that extended for many centuries. The miracle is particularly notable for its dramatic and repeated character, and for the subsequent history of its relics, which survived the turmoil of the Reformation and the suppression of Catholic worship in the Netherlands, in a manner that many regard as itself miraculous. The event began on the 12th of March, 1435, at the home of a sick man named Jan Crayen in Amsterdam. Jan Crayen was gravely ill and had received the last rites, the sacraments given to the dying in the Catholic Church. As part of this ministry, a priest had administered communion to Jan, giving him the consecrated host. Shortly after receiving the host, Jan became sick and vomited. The vomit, along with the host, was thrown into the fire that was burning in the fireplace. A woman present in the house, some accounts name her as Jan's caretaker, then observed that the host was not consumed by the fire. She reached into the fireplace and, without burning her hand, removed the host, which was found to be completely intact and unaffected by the flames. The host was taken to the parish church of St. Nicholas, and word of the miracle spread rapidly. In the days following, further miraculous events were reported, including a repetition of the fire miracle. The host was thrown into the fire again, according to some accounts, to test whether what had been observed was genuine, and again it emerged unburned. The Bishop of Utrecht conducted an investigation and ultimately authorized public veneration of the miracle. The Holy Place Chapel, known as the Heiligsteed, was built on the site of the Jan Crayen House to serve as a place of pilgrimage, and for more than a century, the chapel was one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in the northern European world. The miracle became known throughout Europe, and numerous distinguished visitors, including the Emperor Maximilian, made the pilgrimage to Amsterdam specifically to venerate the miraculous host, the suppression, and the silent procession. When Amsterdam converted to Protestantism following the Reformation. In the late 16th century, the public celebration of Catholic worship was suppressed. The chapel of the Holy Place was taken over and converted to other uses. Yet the memory of the miracle persisted among the Catholic population of Amsterdam, and a form of secret, silent commemoration developed, in which Catholics would walk in a procession through the streets of the city in silence, following the route of the original veneration procession, without any external religious symbols that might attract the attention of the authorities. This silent procession has continued to the present day, and it is regarded as a remarkable living memorial to the events of 1435. The procession, now called the Still Omgang, the Silent Walk, takes place each year in March, and it draws participants from across the Netherlands and from many other countries. The fact that a purely silent, apparently secular walk through the streets of a city has been maintained as a form of religious memory for nearly 500 years is in itself a phenomenon that historians find remarkable. The scientific considerations. The Amsterdam miracle of 1435 presents science with a different kind of challenge than the miracles of Lanciano and Siena. The primary reported phenomenon, the host's resistance to fire, is not susceptible to laboratory analysis in the same way that preserved tissue can be analyzed, since the host itself was not preserved in a form that has survived for scientific study. However, the testimony of the witnesses is recorded in considerable detail in the historical documents of the time, and there are elements of the account that are difficult to dismiss. The host used in Catholic Mass is a thin wafer of unleavened bread, composed primarily of wheat flour and water. It has no special fire-resistant properties. On the contrary, it would be expected to ignite and be consumed in a fire much more rapidly than many other organic materials. The reported behavior of the host, remaining unburned and intact in the fire on 2 separate occasions, and being removable from the flames without burning the hand of the person who retrieved it, is inconsistent with the known physical properties of this material under the conditions described. The careful documentation of the event in historical records, the investigation by the Bishop of Utrecht, and the subsequent establishment of an officially recognized place of pilgrimage by ecclesiastical authority all attest to the seriousness with which contemporaries regarded the event and the degree to which they were satisfied that normal natural explanations had been excluded. Miracle 5. The Eucharistic Miracle of Sukuka, Poland, 2008. Background and context. The miracle of Sukuka is the most recent of the 7 miracles examined in this account, and it is in many respects the most scientifically compelling, precisely because it occurred in an era in which the tools of modern biology, biochemistry, histology, and electron microscopy were available to analyze the relic immediately after the event, without the limitations imposed by having to work with material that had been preserved for centuries under uncertain conditions. The miracle occurred on the 19th of October, 2008, in the town of Sukuka in northeastern Poland, in the parish of St. Anthony. During the celebration of Mass on that day, a consecrated host, a Eucharistic wafer, that according to Catholic belief, had been transformed into the body of Christ through the words of consecration, accidentally fell to the ground. In accordance with standard liturgical procedure, the host was placed in a container of water to dissolve, so that the dissolved material could be disposed of reverently rather than simply discarded. The container with the host was locked in a tabernacle in the sacristy and left there. When the container was checked again a few days later, it was found that the host had not dissolved as expected. Instead, a reddish substance had appeared at the center of the host, forming a stain that appeared to be organic in nature. The host was not dissolving. Rather, it appeared to be undergoing some kind of transformation. The parish priest notified the Archbishop of Białystok, Edward Ozorowski, who ordered that the host be kept under observation and that a scientific analysis be conducted. The scientific analysis. The analysis of the Sukuka host was conducted in 2 stages. The first examination was carried out by Professor Maria Sobaniak-Łotowska, an expert in histopathology at the Medical University of Białystok, and Professor Stanisław Solkowski of the same institution. Both professors were specialists in the study of tissue at the cellular level, and both brought to the investigation the full resources of modern histological analysis, including staining techniques, electron microscopy, and advanced imaging methods that were simply not available to researchers examining older Eucharistic relics. What the 2 professors found was unambiguous and extraordinary. The reddish substance at the center of the host was identified as human cardiac muscle tissue, specifically myocardial tissue from the heart wall. The tissue showed structural characteristics consistent with living heart muscle, including intact cellular membranes, well-defined cell nuclei, and the characteristic cross striations of cardiac muscle fibers. Most remarkably, the tissue showed signs that it had undergone a process consistent with severe stress. The kind of changes in myocardial tissue that are associated with agony, that is to say, with a period of intense suffering and physiological distress immediately preceding death. Professor Sobaniak-Łotowska stated publicly that the tissue was in a state that was entirely inconsistent with any form of artificial production. To create tissue with these characteristics artificially, with the cellular integrity, the structural detail, and the specific signs of physiological stress, would be far beyond the capabilities of any known method of tissue fabrication. The tissue had apparently come into existence within the substance of the Eucharistic host, which is composed only of wheat flour and water, without any source of organic matter that could have given rise to it. The fact that the tissue bore the specific hallmarks of agony, the physiological changes associated with profound suffering, was noted by the investigators as having a particular theological resonance for those who believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The suffering indicated in the tissue was consistent with the suffering of the passion and death of Jesus Christ. The further investigation of 2009. In 2009, additional samples from the Sukuka host were examined by Professor Alexander Domanovsky, a cardiologist and heart surgeon who confirmed the earlier findings. He noted specifically that the myocardial tissue in the host appeared to show what he described as an inseparable union between the tissue and the bread. The two were intertwined in a manner that was structurally inexplicable, since there was no known mechanism by which myocardial tissue could become integrated into a wafer of bread in this way. The tissue was not lying on the surface of the host, nor had it been applied to the host from outside. It was continuous with the substance of the host itself, as if it had grown within it, or had become fused with it at the molecular level. Professor Domanovsky stated that this finding, the integration of the cardiac tissue with the wheat material of the host, was, in his professional opinion as a heart surgeon, impossible to explain by any natural process or any known method of fabrication. He could offer no scientific account of how the tissue could have come to be in the state in which it was found. The Archbishop of Białystok subsequently authorized the veneration of the Sakukka host as an Eucharistic miracle, and the host, enshrined in a special reliquary, is now kept in the Church of Divine Mercy in Sakukka, where it is available for veneration by the faithful. The significance of Sakukka for science. The Sakukka miracle is particularly significant for the scientific discussion of Eucharistic miracles because it is the only major Eucharistic miracle in which the analysis was conducted using the full resources of 21st century medical science within a very short time of the reported event by specialists who were not motivated by religious belief and who had no prior commitment to finding any particular result. Professor Sobaniak-Lotowska, Professor Solkowski, and Professor Domanovsky were approached as scientists to analyze a sample of biological material, and they reported their findings in accordance with the evidence they observed. The consistency of those findings with the findings of researchers who examined the much older relics of Lanciano and Siena, the identification of human cardiac muscle tissue, the signs of physiological stress, the inexplicable preservation, and the inexplicable integration with the Eucharistic material, is a convergence that has attracted considerable attention both in the scientific community and in the theological world. There is simply no natural explanation for how wheat flour and water, which is all that a consecrated host contains from a chemical standpoint, could give rise to tissue of the complexity and specificity described by the investigators. Miracle 6. The Eucharistic Miracle of Buenos Aires, Argentina, 1996. Background and context. The miracle of Buenos Aires holds a special place in the modern discussion of Eucharistic miracles, not only because of the quality of the scientific evidence that was obtained, but also because of its connection to a man who would later become one of the most significant figures in the history of the Church. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who was at the time serving as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires and who in 2013 would be elected Pope, taking the name Francis. It was Archbishop Bergoglio who authorized the preservation of the relic and the scientific investigation of the miracle, and it was he who oversaw the process by which the findings were brought to public attention. The miracle occurred in August of 1996 at the parish church of Santa Maria in Buenos Aires. A consecrated host that had been found abandoned in a candle holder at the back of the church, left there by someone who had received communion, and then, for whatever reason, removed the host from their mouth rather than consuming it, which is considered a serious act of disrespect in Catholic worship, was collected by a priest and, in accordance with standard practice, placed in a container of water to dissolve. The container was placed in a tabernacle in the sacristy. When the container was examined a week later, on the 6th of August, 1996, the host had not dissolved. Instead, a portion of it appeared to have been transformed into a reddish substance that bore no resemblance to the texture and appearance of wheat bread. Archbishop Bergoglio was informed, and photographs were taken. The transformed host was left in the tabernacle, and when it was examined again in the following days, the transformation had intensified. Bergoglio, exercising great caution and discretion, decided not to publicize the event immediately, but instead ordered that the relic be preserved and that photographs and samples be obtained for later analysis. The initial photographs, taken by photographer Enrique Pinto, showed a small piece of tissue clearly visible within the substance of the host, reddish-brown in color and bearing a markedly different texture from the surrounding bread material. The scientific investigation. The investigation of the Buenos Aires host did not become fully public until the early 2000s, when Bergoglio finally authorized a full scientific examination of the preserved material. Samples from the host were sent without any indication of their origin or the circumstances in which they had been obtained to a series of laboratories in different countries. The samples were presented simply as biological samples of unknown origin to be analyzed and identified by independent forensic and histological specialists. The most detailed and widely cited analysis was conducted in the United States by Dr. Frederick Zagubi, a distinguished cardiovascular pathologist and forensic examiner who served for many years as the chief medical examiner of Rockland County, New York, and who was a professor at Columbia University. Zagubi was given the sample without any information about where it had come from or what its purported significance might be. He analyzed the sample using standard histological techniques and found it to consist of myocardial tissue, cardiac muscle from the left ventricle of the heart, in a state that showed the specific cellular changes associated with severe trauma and intense suffering. The tissue showed white blood cells infiltrating the myocardial fibers, a finding that is characteristic of living tissue under extreme physiological stress. Crucially, Zagubi noted that the presence of white blood cells in the tissue indicated that it was living at the time when the trauma occurred. White blood cells do not survive in dead tissue. Dr. Zagubi submitted his report and was then told, for the first time, that the sample he had examined had come from a Eucharistic host, from a wafer of consecrated bread. According to the accounts of those present, Zagubi was visibly astonished. He is reported to have stated that what he had been shown was a fragment of the myocardium, the muscle of the heart wall, that was alive at the time of the injury that had caused the cellular changes he had observed, and that the presence of intact white blood cells confirmed this. He could offer no explanation for how such tissue could have come to be present in a piece of consecrated bread. The blood type and the connection to Lanciano and Sakuka. When the blood type of the Buenos Aires sample was analyzed, it was found to be type AB, the same blood type as the Lanciano relic, the Siena relic, and the other Eucharistic miracles that have been subject to blood typing analysis. The recurrence of this blood type, and specifically of myocardial tissue, with signs of extreme physiological stress, across independent miracles occurring in different countries, separated by many centuries, and subjected to analysis by different scientific teams, is a convergence that researchers have found extraordinarily difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The consistency of the findings across Lanciano, 8th century, Siena, 13th century, and Buenos Aires, 20th century, all identifying human cardiac muscle tissue of blood type AB, all showing signs of physiological stress or trauma, has led a number of scientists and theologians to suggest that if these events are to be interpreted as fabrications or as natural phenomena, the burden falls entirely on those who make such a claim to explain not only the individual findings but the consistent pattern across independent occurrences. The role of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The discretion and pastoral wisdom with which Bergoglio handled the Buenos Aires miracle has been widely praised. Rather than rushing to publicize the event or to declare it a miracle before the evidence was examined, he preserved the relic, obtained documentation, and commissioned independent scientific analysis without revealing the nature of the material to the investigators. When the scientific findings came back consistent with all previous Eucharistic miracles, the case for the genuineness of the event was correspondingly strengthened. Bergoglio's later elevation to the papacy has, for many observers, given the event an additional layer of significance. The man who quietly preserved and documented this Eucharistic miracle became, a decade and a half later, the Bishop of Rome. Miracle 7. The Eucharistic Miracle of Tixtla, Mexico, 2006. Background and context. The miracle of Tixtla, which occurred in the Mexican state of Guerrero in October of 2006, is the most recent of the major Eucharistic miracles to have been fully investigated scientifically and to have received formal recognition by ecclesiastical authorities. The event took place during a spiritual renewal retreat organized by the Diocese of Chilpancingo, Chilapa. and it was witnessed by a large number of people, including the priest, who was celebrating the Mass at which the miracle occurred. On the 8th of October 2006, Sister Patricia Greaves Murillo, a member of the religious congregation of the Servants of the Lord and the Virgin of Matará, was distributing communion during a Mass that formed part of the spiritual retreat. She was giving communion by handing consecrated hosts to the people receiving. At a certain moment, she found that she was holding a host from which a reddish substance was beginning to emerge, visible to her and to those near her. She showed the host to the priest celebrating the Mass, and the transformation continued to develop over the following hours. The host gradually acquired a substantial reddish area, concentrated at the center, which appeared organic in nature. The Bishop of Chilpancingo, Chilapa, Alejo Zavala Castro, was informed of the event and ordered that the host be preserved under careful conditions and that a scientific investigation be conducted. The investigation was authorized to proceed, and it was conducted with a level of rigor and transparency that has made the Tixla miracle one of the most carefully documented Eucharistic events of recent decades. The scientific investigation. Samples from the Tixla host were analyzed by Dr. Ricardo Castañón Gómez, a Bolivian neurologist and researcher who had previously been involved in the investigation of the Buenos Aires miracle and who had become known in scientific circles for his work on the analysis of Eucharistic relics. Castañón assembled a team of investigators for the Tixla case and, as had been done with the Buenos Aires sample, submitted portions of the Tixla host to independent laboratories without disclosing the origin or nature of the material. The results of the analysis were consistent with those obtained from the Buenos Aires and Socuca investigations. The reddish substance was identified as human blood, specifically blood type AB. The tissue components found in the sample were identified as myocardial tissue, cardiac muscle, showing the same characteristics that had been observed in the other investigations. Intact cellular structure, evidence of the striated muscle fibers of the heart wall, and signs of physiological distress. As in the other cases, the tissue showed the cellular changes associated with severe trauma and, in the opinion of the researchers, with a process of agony. One of the most striking aspects of the Tixla analysis was the finding that the blood in the sample was fresh. That is to say, it showed the characteristics of blood that had been recently produced and that had not undergone the normal processes of coagulation and decomposition that would be expected in blood that had been separated from a living body for any significant length of time. The host had been stored for a period before the analysis was conducted, and yet the blood found in it had the characteristics of fresh, living blood. This finding was, in the opinion of the investigators, entirely inconsistent with any natural explanation. The team also conducted an analysis to determine whether the reddish substance could have been produced by any external contamination, by a naturally occurring fungus, bacterium, or other microorganism, for example, or by any form of deliberate application of blood or biological material to the host. The analysis excluded all of these possibilities. The distribution of the reddish material within the host was found to be inconsistent with surface contamination. The material appeared to have originated within the substance of the host itself, in a pattern that the investigators found impossible to explain by any known natural process, the formal ecclesiastical recognition. In 2013, after a prolonged period of investigation and deliberation, Bishop Zavala Castro formally declared the Tixla event to be a Eucharistic miracle. The declaration followed the completion of all the required canonical investigations and was accompanied by the publication of the scientific findings that had been obtained during the investigation. The Tixla host is preserved in a special reliquary and made available for veneration by the faithful of the diocese. The Tixla miracle is particularly significant in the current era because it occurred at a time when the scientific tools for investigating such phenomena are more powerful than at any previous point in history. And yet the investigators found themselves no more able to provide a natural explanation than their predecessors had been, when confronted with the relics of Lanciano 7 centuries earlier. The consistency of the findings, cardiac muscle tissue, blood type AB, signs of agony, inexplicable integration with the Eucharistic material, freshness inconsistent with the known storage conditions, points to a pattern that science, as currently constituted, cannot account for. Scientific observations across all 7 miracles, a synthesis, the recurring pattern of cardiac muscle tissue. One of the most striking features of the scientific investigations of modern Eucharistic miracles is the consistency with which they have identified the same type of tissue. In the miracles of Lanciano, Siena, Socuca, Buenos Aires, and Tixla, independent investigations conducted by different teams, using different analytical methods, in different countries and different centuries, have all identified the material found in the Eucharistic relics as cardiac muscle tissue, specifically myocardial tissue from the wall of the heart. This is not a vague or generic identification. It is a specific histological finding that requires the presence of characteristic cellular structures, the striated muscle fibers, the cell nuclei, the cellular membranes, and the specific architectural arrangement of the myocardium that are distinctive enough to permit identification under the microscope. The probability that this pattern could arise by chance, that 5 independent fabrications, produced in different countries across a span of 12 centuries, all happened to incorporate cardiac muscle tissue as their fraudulent substitute for Eucharistic bread, is vanishingly small, even before any consideration is given to the question of how such tissue could have been obtained and incorporated into the relics without leaving any trace of the method of incorporation. The blood type AB. Equally striking is the consistency of the blood type found in the relics that have been subjected to blood typing analysis, in every case where blood has been identified and successfully typed. Lanciano, Siena, Bolsena Orvieto, Socuca, Buenos Aires, Tixla, and others. The blood has been found to be type AB. Blood type AB is found in only about 3 to 5% of the human population, depending on the ethnic group considered. The probability that multiple independent relics, fabricated at different times and in different places, would all happen to use blood of the same rare type is, again, extraordinarily small. The coincidence between the blood type found in the Eucharistic relics and the blood type found in the Shroud of Turin, the cloth that many Catholics and a number of scientists believe to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, has been noted repeatedly by researchers. The Shroud of Turin has been subjected to extensive scientific examination, and while the dating and interpretation of the shroud remain contested, the blood found on the shroud has been consistently identified as type AB. Whether or not one accepts the religious significance of this convergence, its existence as an empirical fact is beyond dispute, and it is a fact that any comprehensive scientific account of the Eucharistic miracles must address: the signs of agony and living tissue. Another finding that appears consistently across the modern investigations is the presence of signs of severe physiological stress, what the investigators have variously described as agony, trauma, and distress, in the cardiac tissue found in the relics. In the Socuca, Buenos Aires, and Tixla investigations, the researchers noted specifically that the tissue showed the cellular changes characteristic of a heart under extreme stress, with white blood cells infiltrating the myocardial fibers in a manner consistent with an acute physiological crisis. Dr. Zujaib's finding in the Buenos Aires case, that the white blood cells present in the tissue indicated that the tissue was alive at the time of the trauma, is of particular significance. White blood cells are highly sensitive indicators of physiological activity. They do not survive in dead or decaying tissue. Their presence in a sample means that the tissue from which they came was living when it experienced the injury or stress that triggered the inflammatory response. The presence of living, white blood cell-infiltrated cardiac tissue in a Eucharistic host is, as Zugaib himself stated, something for which there is no natural explanation, the preservation anomaly. Across all the miracles examined in this account, a consistent theme is the extraordinary preservation of organic material under conditions that would normally result in rapid deterioration. The Lanciano flesh and blood have survived for more than 12 centuries without chemical preservation. The Siena hosts have survived for nearly 8 centuries. The Bolsena Orvieto corporal has retained analyzable blood for more than 750 years. The Sokuka host showed fresh tissue within days of the reported miracle. The Buenos Aires tissue showed living cells years after the reported event. The Tixla blood appeared fresh after prolonged storage. None of these observations can be accounted for by any known natural mechanism of preservation. The scientific literature on the decomposition of biological materials is extensive and well established. Organic tissue, under the conditions in which these relics have been kept, does not survive for these periods of time in the states in which it has been found. The options available to the scientist confronted with this evidence are limited. Either the evidence has been misrepresented, either the relics have been tampered with or fabricated in a way that has escaped detection by all the investigators who have examined them, or the phenomena cannot be explained by the tools and frameworks currently available to science. The investigators who have examined these relics, including those who approached the task as skeptics, those who had no prior religious commitment, and those who brought the most advanced techniques of modern science to bear on the material, have, in general, found themselves unable to identify any evidence of fraud or fabrication and unable to provide a natural account of what they observed. This does not, by itself, constitute scientific proof of the supernatural. Science, by its nature, cannot affirm or deny the existence of the supernatural. But it does constitute a recognition by science of its own limits in the face of these phenomena, the impossibility of fabrication. Perhaps the most important scientific consideration in the evaluation of Eucharistic miracles is the question of fabrication. For the events described in this account to have been produced by human deception, one would need to posit the existence, in the 8th century, of individuals with the technical knowledge and the biological materials required to introduce myocardial tissue of blood type AB into a Eucharistic host, to preserve it for centuries without chemical treatment, and to do so in a manner that would leave no trace detectable by 21st century forensic analysis. One would need to posit the same for the 13th century, for the 15th century, and for the 20th century, and one would need to explain why these independent fabrications all arrived at the same biological conclusion. Cardiac muscle tissue, blood type AB, signs of agony. The histological knowledge required to fabricate the specific tissue found in these relics, to produce a sample that would fool a trained myocardial pathologist using electron microscopy, was not available in the 8th, 13th, or even early 20th century. The forensic methods required to introduce such tissue into a Eucharistic host without leaving physical traces that would be detectable by modern analysis did not and do not exist. The hypothesis of fabrication does not merely require us to posit deception. It requires us to posit deception of a kind that is technically impossible, and to posit it independently, in multiple countries, across multiple centuries, all arriving at the same result. Theological reflections on the scientific evidence, what science can and cannot say. Science is a method of inquiry based on observation, measurement, and the formulation and testing of hypotheses against empirical evidence. It is an extraordinarily powerful method for understanding the natural world, and it has produced the greatest expansion of human knowledge in the history of our species. But it is not, and has never claimed to be, a method for evaluating claims that lie outside the domain of the natural world. Science can tell us what is consistent with natural processes and what is not. It cannot tell us whether events that are inconsistent with natural processes are therefore supernatural, since the category of the supernatural lies, by definition, outside the scope of scientific inquiry. When scientists who have examined Eucharistic relics conclude that they cannot account for what they have found by any natural means, they are doing exactly what good science requires of them. They are reporting their findings honestly, acknowledging the limits of current scientific knowledge, and refraining from assertions that go beyond what the evidence can establish. The fact that several of these scientists have subsequently expressed personal religious or spiritual responses to their findings is understandable and does not invalidate their scientific work. It testifies, rather, to the human experience of encountering mystery in the most precise and exacting circumstances, the convergence of evidence. What is theologically significant about the scientific findings examined in this account is not that any individual miracle has been conclusively proved to be supernatural. Science cannot prove or disprove the supernatural, but that the pattern of evidence across multiple independent miracles is strikingly and consistently convergent. The same tissue type, the same blood type, the same signs of physiological distress, the same inexplicable preservation, the same impossibility of fabrication. These are the findings that emerge time after time from independent investigations conducted by independent scientists using independent methods. They form a pattern that demands explanation, and the natural explanations that have been proposed have, to date, failed to account for it. For the believer, this convergence is confirmation of what faith already holds, that in the Eucharist, Christ is truly present, body and blood, soul and divinity, and that these miracles are signs, extraordinary, tangible signs, of that presence, given by a God who knows that human beings, in their weakness, sometimes need visible evidence to sustain their faith, just as the doubting Basilian monk of Lanciano needed it in the 8th century, and just as the doubting German priest of Bolsena needed it in the 13th. For the scientist, the convergence is a puzzle, a genuine, unresolved puzzle that sits at the boundary between what is known and what is not yet known, between what can be measured and what lies beyond measurement. It does not, in itself, require any particular conclusion, but it does invite a kind of humility, a recognition that the universe, and perhaps human experience within it, contains dimensions that are not yet captured by any equation or any instrument, and that the ancient human intuition that there is more to reality than what the senses can measure may not be as naive as the modern mind sometimes assumes, the witness of suffering. There is one aspect of the scientific findings from these miracles that deserves special reflection, beyond the technical details of histology and blood chemistry. Across the 5 modern investigations, Lanciano, Siena, Socuca, Buenos Aires, Tixtla, the consistent finding is not merely that cardiac muscle tissue has appeared in Eucharistic hosts, but that this tissue bears the marks of suffering. The tissue shows the cellular changes of agony, the infiltration of white blood cells characteristic of a heart under violent stress, the features that a heart surgeon would associate with a person dying in pain. If these miracles are genuine, if the tissue in these hosts is, as the investigators found no reason to doubt and every reason to assert, real human cardiac tissue, then the suffering inscribed in that tissue is not incidental or decorative. It is part of the message. It speaks, in the language of biology, of a passion, a suffering freely undertaken, and it does so not in the language of theology or of art or of poetry, but in the language of cellular pathology, in a medium that requires not faith but a microscope to read. This is perhaps the most profound dimension of these miracles for those who reflect on them with care, that they speak not of a God remote and untouched by human pain, but of one who, in the most physical and verifiable terms, has entered into suffering, whose body, if the evidence is to be believed, bears still the marks of what was endured, and who makes those marks available, in the tissue of a Eucharistic host, to anyone who cares to look. Conclusion: the 7 Eucharistic miracles examined in this account, Lanciano, Siena, Bolsena, Orvieto, Amsterdam, Socuca, Buenos Aires, and Tixtla, represent a remarkable convergence of historical record, religious tradition, and scientific investigation. They span nearly 13 centuries, from the 8th century miracle of a doubting Basilian monk to the 21st century analysis, conducted with electron microscopes and advanced histological techniques. They have been investigated by scientists of very different backgrounds and motivations, and those investigations have consistently produced findings that the investigators themselves have described as inexplicable by natural means. The scientific community has not, in general, rushed to embrace these findings as evidence of the supernatural, and this reticence is understandable and appropriate. Science is a conservative institution, rightly slow to abandon naturalistic explanations and rightly cautious about claims that exceed the scope of empirical inquiry. But neither has the scientific community been able to explain away the findings. The relics of Lanciano continue to consist of human cardiac tissue of blood type AB after more than 12 centuries without preservation. The tissue of Sakuka continues to show living cardiac muscle with signs of agony that appeared within the substance of a Eucharistic host within days of its reported discovery. The blood of Buenos Aires continues to be identified by a leading cardiovascular pathologist as human myocardial tissue bearing the marks of suffering. These are facts, not claims of faith, not assertions of belief, but findings reported by scientists in peer-reviewed literature and in official investigative reports. They cannot be wished away, and they have not been explained. They stand as monuments to the limits of what science, as currently constituted, can account for, and as invitations to the deeper human faculties, the capacity for wonder, the openness to mystery, the willingness to consider that the world is richer and stranger than our most sophisticated models yet reflect. Whether one approaches them as a believer seeking confirmation, as a skeptic seeking refutation, or simply as a curious human being seeking understanding, the Eucharistic miracles examined in this account offer something that is rare in any domain of inquiry, evidence that is simultaneously ancient and fresh, simultaneously material and inexplicable, simultaneously the product of the most ordinary substances, bread and wine, and the occasion for the most extraordinary findings that modern science has been called upon to evaluate. They remain, in the most precise and literal sense of the word, miraculous.